All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest Joshua Cutchin. We are going to be talking about his new book, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. You know, when I read the title of this, Josh, I thought to myself, okay, so, you know, we look at stuff that's sort of trending in the paranormal because we want to, you know, provide topics and like national park missings and stuff like that are definitely trending and have been for quite some time. And I always thought it was interesting, but I'm all like, you know, if I was going to kill people, I'd do it in a national park. That's where they are. You know? But
Sure.
Thieves in A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abduction, when I read this subtag, I'm just all like, okay. And so, you know, I got to tell you, you know, I don't know. I think how did you get into this is a weird question to start with. So I'm going to start with something else and say, how far back do supernatural child abductions go? Like how far back are we talking?
You know, I don't think that at all is really an odd question because it's very dark subject matter. You can look, you know, it depends on what sort of science you want to, you know, engage with in terms of what the oldest civilizations are in, you know, on the planet. If you, as a lot of emerging scholarship suggests, believe that the Australian Aborigines are indeed the oldest, you know, extant civilization that we still have, then you would easily say it starts there. The Pimeriquitae, which I'm probably completely butchering, were sort of like, you know, sort of like land spirits, or could sort of be vaguely treated as fairy analogs for the Australian Aborigines. For that part of the world. You know, in terms of Western tradition, a lot of it can be brought back to two Hebraic, early Hebrew entities. Moloch, which was sort of a splinter sect of a pagan god that demanded sacrifice. But in terms of the tradition as we understand it, you know, in the West, specifically Lilith, who, depending on, again, different texts, different sources, was supposedly the first wife of Adam, pre-Eve. And she was banished for, you know, again, depending on your source, various reasons. But she was oftentimes blamed for stealing children, sometimes even from the womb. Some people claim that you can actually trace her origins back to an earlier deity from Mesopotamian mythology named Lamash-2, who sort of had similar attributes. But at least in sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it was Lilith who was stealing children. Some people say that she was stealing children because her own children that she fathered with Adam were banished, or, you know, all of her other children were demons. They're, again, very, very different motivations ascribed to her. But a lot of it tends to go back to Lilith. Some people even claim, to the extent that, you know, this is where the term lullaby comes from. Lilith Abai. That's why you're saying a prayer over your child as you put them to sleep. Similarly, Lilith could also appear as a black cat. Some people suspect that might be where the origins of, you know, cats stealing babies' breath, that superstition might have come from as well. But kind of all goes back to Lilith. Not Fraser Crane's wife, though.
Right.
Yeah, that's
similar
right, Adam.
attitude, though. Similar
Blame the ex-wife, you know,
Right,
for stealing children. The judge gave her visitation rights, dude.
You know, you know, speaking of which, you know, Lilith, you know, Kara's a big fan of vampires. I'm a big fan of horror. Lilith is a name that comes up not too uncommonly. And I always felt that Lilith, being Adam's first wife, was more of a construct of the 20th century. But I wasn't basing this off of anything. I just kind of assumed that it was. But you're saying that there are texts that say this way further back, huh?
I mean, yeah, you can look back. For example, the Jewish Zohar has an interaction where Elijah the prophet actually runs across Lilith, and she explains her motivations that she's going to go off to the house of a certain woman and take her child and drain it of its blood. Again, that sort of vampiric motif that you're talking about as well. But, you know, I think it's almost, you know, it is in some sense apocryphal. Not a lot of people really talk about Lilith. But I think that she's kind of become a catch-all and has, sort of her figure, the figure of Lilith, has sort of syncretized a lot of other myths from that Middle Eastern region as well regarding these sort of, predatory female baby snatching figures.
Right.
And not only does she seem sort of like a little bit of a melting pot for a lot of these motifs, but a lot of other different entities that sort of spun off from her. I mean, you could in some ways say that she was not only the first vampiress, but you could sort of see how she could be the first, succubus or the first witch, all sorts of things like that.
Right. Another way to marginalize people at the time who had very little power. I like how they put so much evil.
Oh yeah.
Like, that's really funny. But
tale is old as time. For
yeah,
sure.
but an awesome aesthetic. I mean, appearing
agreed.
as a black cat, the whole.
Agreed.
It's all good.
Right.
Except for killing children. That's
so.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, this might be off topic for our discussion tonight, but I am curious about this. Why did Adam and Lilith break up?
Well, again, you look into these texts. So I'm going to answer that question by going in a little bit different direction. I'll circle back around. One of my primary fields of interest is fairy folklore. Specifically Western European fairy folklore. And if you look at exactly what the fairies were or where this particular sort of set of myths and legends originated, you'll get a bunch of different answers. They're fallen angels, according to Christian traditions, or they're spirits of the land or place, or they're the sacred dead. And there's no real good answer for any of these things. And similarly, you'll find not only Lilith's origins, but also where Lilith's progeny ended up and why they ended up being what they are. According to some people, Lilith's children, that she sired with Adam, were what we call demons today, or what we call fairies today, or any number of things. And similarly, the reason for which she was not expelled, banished by God, you'll find different reasons for that. The one that kept on cropping up in my research, which is a really, really odd thing, is that she would not submit to intercourse underneath Adam. She always demanded to be on top of Adam, which, I wouldn't care, but
yeah,
I'm lazy as all hell. I'm all on board for that.
but again, it ties into those sort of submission motifs that you were mentioning earlier with marginalized people. So
I figured that was a factor.
She had such strong top energy that they had to banish her from the Garden of Eden. I love that.
Yeah, and some people say that it was in her nature. She was created from filth rather than from dust. And some people say that she was just promiscuous with demons, and that's why she was banished. So you'll find, again, a lot of different variations on the same set of legends. Or not to be disparaging about people who I use legends and in myths and religion, all those sort of things compiled together.
Sure. I understand that any one of these is one-to-one person and something else to another, and you brought up fairies there, and I had a feeling that this was going to be a big part of it because, again, as a fan of horror movies and horror stories, this is a very reoccurring topic. There's the things that live in the trees that take the kids that come back and steal their form. There's the taking the babies. There's the sacrifice. So
changeling myths.
Changelings, yeah. So where did this really start? I mean, I think the average lay person, which I am when it comes to a lot of these, would say that fairies really is an English-British thing. Is it? Is that where we're seeing it start? Or?
Well, I guess kind of would be the best way to put it. If you look at, the fairy folk as a motif, there really are very, very few entities, or rather very few cultures across the world that don't describe short entities that tend to live underground, that tend to have an affinity for stealing children. In this book, you'll find it in Africa, you'll find it in Native America, you'll find it North America, rather, you'll find it in South America, literally everywhere but Antarctica. And of course, those are sort of your general parameters. Sometimes they won't live underground. Sometimes they'll be spirits of place. Sometimes they won't be short. But that's sort of the generalized suite of things. There is a strong tendency to focus on Western Europe in my work, but that's just because I have an affinity for that part of the world, given my heritage. But again, just like fairies, you'll also find changeling stories from island Southeast Asia and Australia, South America, North America, and again, Africa. And Africa's one of Africa's changeling motifs is called the Abiku. So if anybody's wondering exactly what a changeling is, in the context of Western Europe, it was one of several things. It was either, the basic idea was that a child would be stolen and it would be replaced with one of three things: either a sickly fairy infant, an elderly sickly fairy person, or a piece of wood or some other sort of detritus that was cloaked to look like a child. And generally speaking, they would be very listless. They would be ill-tempered. They would consume and consume and consume, and would eventually die. Was typically the narrative that you'd find. And of course, this would be a changeling. It wouldn't be your actual child. It would be a fairy imposter. But if you look at sort of the motif of the changeling and its originations, you can find it all the way back, again, in Abrahamic tradition. Changeling stories don't really appear in pre-Christian Ireland, which is where we normally associate the fairies with being. Again, in the Zohar, which is a Hebrew text that I mentioned earlier, it said that if you thought of someone else during the conception of your child, that child would essentially be a changeling. St. Augustine spoke about this idea of these children who were basically, you thought that they were your children, but they would actually be children of the devil. Similarly, interestingly enough, Martin Luther, of all people, claimed to have run into an actual changeling himself. But it definitely has older roots than that. I think in the 13th century, William of Auvergne mentioned this. He used this term called cambio or cambini to mean these sort of half-human substitution, children of substitution. Interestingly enough, I say Abrahamic, I mean that not just in terms of Judaism and Christianity, but also in terms of Islam as well. It's startling to read some of these stories from the Middle East where you could literally substitute everything for Ireland or the Christian faith, and it would read exactly the same. Changelings were also something that the jinn in Middle Eastern and Arabic folklore would do as well. They would take human children for their own and leave something else behind.
It's amazing. Sorry, go ahead, Kara.
Well, I might be getting ahead of myself here, but in terms of thinking about why this is that all these cultures have this myth, is it credible to think, sometime in prehistory this developed and it sort of spread between all these cultures, before the invention of writing? Or do we have to explain it by saying, there's something in nature in all of these, just everywhere, that causes these myths to arise?
Well, my first good question. My first book was on this idea of the food taboo, that if you were to consume food in fairyland, you'd be trapped there forever. Mm-hmm. And that's another belief that you'll find on literally every continent amongst every indigenous peoples. So the thing that I find interesting about that particular question of yours is that we really have three options here. We have one, that there was some sort of cross-contamination of cultures, which would imply the fact that the world was a lot more globalized than traditional mainstream historians want to admit. So that's weird and anomalous, right?
Or that this topic goes back so incredibly far,
Right. Yeah. To like the first civilization.
Right.
And then it's been preserved in that sense. Two, that a Jungian collective conscious is indeed a thing. Or three, that there's some sort of objective truth to these as actual entities, actual forces that we interact with. All three of those are really pretty startling.
Strange. Yeah.
All three of those are strange, but people will say, "Oh, it's a universal motif, etc." It's like, well, there's some implications there. So I really don't know. I tend to suspect, I hesitate to say believe, but I tend to suspect that there is an objective reality to some of these stories. I do think that mankind interacts with non-human intelligences, or at least intelligences that, if they come from, at least in a Jungian way, if they come from mankind, or end up being so externalized and alien that we assume that they're some sort of non-human intelligence. But there is something that people are interacting with in a lot of these different stories. The changeling thing, I have a whole chapter in my book dedicated to the fact that as this trope of the changeling took hold, especially in more recent centuries, it was tragically used to justify infanticide, particularly in the case of children who were developmentally disabled. And that's I always have to say that when I say that. I think that changelings, there was something to it, because obviously, in, I would say, a majority of the cases, a gross majority, probably 90% of the cases that you hear, it's somebody who's looking for an excuse to kill a child with disabilities, which is
that very much makes sense, and it's not a bad place to go. I mean, think about the world now where everybody looks at racism from the past and everybody goes just, oh, well, I'd be on the right side of history, and be all like, well, if we all would have been on the right side of history, history wouldn't have been the history that it was. History is not a pleasant place to be in a lot of these situations, and I can totally see that as being the case.
I mean, that's very true. I mean, like, what are we doing today? What are we saying in this conversation that in 50 or 100 years is going to be looked at anathema?
Exactly.
To put that detail in perspective, there's a book that I came across in my research that I always, again, I feel like it's part of my responsibility to acknowledge this, because it's such a startling statistic, and to sort of raise awareness of this topic. There's a book by a scholar named Elaine Farrell, called A Most Diabolical Deed. And she looked at a 50-year period in Ireland. And she looked at infanticide of children who were less than 3 years old. So here are your parameters: 50-year span, Ireland, which is about the size of Indiana, and children less than 3 years old. So if they were 3 years and 1 day, they didn't make the cut for her study. In that time span, she found 4,645 cases of infanticide, which is astounding. Obviously this is sort of part of the culture. And if you look at the heavily agrarian culture of Ireland during that period, and you had 4 kids of your own already, and you had this kid that was going to take up resources and wasn't going to help on the farm. I'm not going to say it's understandable, because I don't think it's justified at all, but you can kind of sort of see what people were thinking in doing that, as horrible as it is.
Look at historically I'm sure that they were more often girls than boys, I'm gonna guess.
Well, I mean, that's interesting if you say that, because not only were the changeling stories typically about girls. I mean, I can really count on one hand the number of changeling stories were typically about boys. I can count on one hand the number of changeling stories I found about girls. But also, developmental disabilities tend to, medically speaking, impact males differently than females. So, maybe. But it's a very sobering statistic, and people have tried to figure out if there was a specific suite of disabilities that people would cite as being, oh, that means they're a changeling. There are a lot of different candidates that I go through in the book. Things that you find, these behaviors of the changelings that do things that sound like autism, or they sound like spina bifida, or these different things. And there are some really compelling candidates, and it might not be exactly one answer. At the same time, there are some stories that you have to wrestle with that get really quite fantastical. And, this idea that all this can be explained by some sort of developmental disability kind of goes out the window when, the changeling sits up in its crib and talks to you and flies out the chimney, So, some of those are apocryphal
as
and folk
kids with
tales.
autism do.
Yeah, right. So some of these stories it's really weird. They sit at this intersection of historical fact and apocryphal, folktale, and legend, and it's really hard to separate them out sometimes.
And I'm sure it's extra difficult because we're dealing with well, you said that you have twins, and I've had kids, and it's a humans spanning fear is with your children. And, that was part of when this topic first came up. I'm just all, well, I mean, people are scared of their kids and they're scared of what's going to happen to their kids. And when other people lose their kid and, maybe they lie to their kids to try to get them to have the fear to stay close. And those were the thoughts going through my head. But, I'm a little disappointed in man when we talk about this, how much of it seems to tie to sexuality and progeny. So much of it seems to be tied to sort of arrogant factors and not protective factors.
Well, and that sort of compounds itself, especially, I keep on going back to, even though I outlined the fact that fairy folklore in the broadest sense is really a worldwide phenomenon, I keep on going back to the British Isles, specifically Ireland, because that's where you find the richest vein of this changeling tradition. But in those stories, it was, the most vulnerable category was children, and the second most vulnerable category were women. So, it was definitely built into, some sort of power structure of the time as well. There were many a marriage, I'm sure, that was called off because the man suddenly decided that his wife was a changeling. There's a very famous case of a woman named Bridget Cleary, whose husband was convinced that she was a changeling, and he actually ended up, through several of the methods prescribed to determine whether or not someone was a changeling, actually ended up killing her. And if you want an idea, we can go into those methods. We don't necessarily have to, but if you are familiar with the sort of methods of proving witches and witch trials, it's sort of along the same idea. The idea was that if you were to abuse a changeling enough, that its people, the fairy folk, would not want to see one of their own abused and would rush in and re-exchange your child for one of theirs.
That's weird. So it's like justified to beat him.
Oh, I mean, beating is kind of the least egregious. Yes, it's the least egregious. I mean, leaving them at crossroads, putting them in open graves, pinching them with iron tongs, roasting them above a fire. Some people have claimed that this is one of the origins of the term, trial by fire. Splashing urine in their face, poisoning them with foxglove, any number of things. Some of them, and not all of the methods were this violent. I mean, some of them were. There's a series of standing stones on the coast of Cornwall that if you pass the child through the stone, supposedly that would cure them of being a changeling. And some of the more whimsical ones, which you can find in stuff like Grimm, the Grimm brothers, where that you would do something absurd. Typically, this was, boiling porridge or boiling beer or making a stew in some sort of weird vessel. So depending on where you were, you'd be boiling beer and acorns, or you'd be, boiling a stew in clamshells, or just some sort of nonsensical thing. And the idea was that it would be so bizarre that this changeling, which in many cases, as I mentioned, was actually an elderly fairy, would sit up and say, well, I'm 900 years old and I've never seen anybody do something this silly. And at that point you'd say, oh, I've got you. And then, they would rush up through the chimney or out the window or something. Yeah.
That seems like the sort of thing that would only work once, but what do I know?
I know, right.
I feel like word would get around in the fairy community.
I think it was amongst the Sami, I think it's Finnish. You would actually construct a spoon that was so tall it would have to go up through the chimney, and then the changeling would say, I've never seen a spoon that big. And you're like, oh, you're talking, baby. You must be a changeling. And then they would be outed. So again, those are sort of the more lighthearted.
So apparently changelings are very familiar with spoons and regular spoon heights.
They think they know everything about mortals, I guess. But again, I mean, there was another deposition that I found of a grandmother in I can't remember exactly where. It was in Ireland. I can't remember which county. Where she was actually acquitted after drowning her grandchild because she said that she was just trying to quote unquote put the fairy out of it, because she was convinced that it was a changeling, and if you try to drown the changeling, that it would be reversed. So, and there are plenty of stories, some that depending on what you read, some that read as if they are traditional accounts, factual accounts. that claim that children were restored after some of these methods. I don't know if I necessarily believe that, but it's an uncomfortable but consistent, sort of suite of stories that we're left with.
Right. All right. Well, we're coming up on break here. You're listening to Joshua Cutchin, and we're talking about his book, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. When we come back, Joshua, I want to see if there's any parallels between these old ones and between missing children today. You're listening to Radio Wasteland. All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland and our guest, Joshua Cutchin. We're talking about his book, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abduction. Before the break, we talked a lot about the history of supernatural child abduction, trying to go as far back as we could, then going all through on the way up, covering a lot of the world. But, nowadays, we live in this, especially through the 70s and Stranger Danger and, serial killer parallels. I'm sure that you've touched down on some parallels between today and then. And, so are there any parallels or situations?
Are supernatural child abduction still happening?
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, you can't write a book like this without sort of touching upon like the satanic panic stuff and whatnot. But I was really trying to focus in on not only things that I thought had a little bit more basis than the satanic panic stuff, but also the supernatural element too. But not necessarily looking at human child abduction, which honestly, I mean, it's sort of a smokescreen for me to talk about this topic in a little bit more detached way, because when I start talking about like human child trafficking rings and everything, that gets really, really uncomfortable for me really quickly.
I don't blame you.
I was writing this book while my wife was pregnant with twins, so it's like, this is some really dark places. My original
So what
idea,
made you think of this?
Well, now we can circle back around.
I thought,
Well, so I've primarily had interest in fairy folklore, and at the same time, I'd written a book on the food taboo that I mentioned, and I'd written a book on supernatural scents and odors, which I didn't really talk about fairy lore that much in that book. And I said, I really want to write about fairy folklore, but I also want to write something creepy. And this kind of took the cake in that regard. At the same time, I wanted to have sort of a one-stop shop book for people about changelings. I think up until mine, there was only really one book that it really was just dedicated just to the changeling phenomena, as opposed to the changeling phenomena in terms of fairy folklore as a whole. And that was an out-of-print German book called Der Wechselbalg, which I think there are just a handful of copies still in print. And it's not translated at all. So I said, that's sort of the impetus for this. And, a lot of my reason for my interest in fairy folklore is because I'm absolutely convinced that it is part and parcel with what we would call modern alien abduction lore. Not saying that fairies are aliens or aliens are fairies, if either thing exists at all. But I think that we are making the common mistake of assuming that these things are not related. But the list of things, the sort of data points with which these things correspond, is really just too coincidental for me. You've got not only the fact are these beings generally reported as being short in a lot of these abduction stories, but also you've got these shorter beings supervised by a taller figure, the fairy queen in the case of fairy lore, or a taller supervising alien gray in modern abductions. They both tend to use wands, both tend to levitate people, both tend to abduct people from dark roads that they've somehow enchanted people to walk or drive down in the middle of the night. And if you keep on going into this, you can find parallels to literally alien implants in fairy folklore with things like the fairy blast. It's basically, after looking at this for a while, it's like, well, if you can find one thing in one, you can find one thing in the other. And so part of this book was also saying, well, if that's the case, then let's put your money where your mouth is and see if you can find, points of comparison between these changeling stories and this modern abduction encounter. So in terms of like the modern stories of supernatural child abduction, you really do have to look at our sort of current boogeyman, which in this case, abducting children are, these alien abductions, which it's interesting because the alien abductions, just as with fairy folklore, tend to focus upon youth, generally speaking. You don't have a lot of people who have their first abduction when they're 30 or 40. Generally, it's younger in life, or at least it comes out through a series of, hypnotic regressions or whatever. Your mileage may vary on hypnotic regression. Mine certainly does, but I'm just saying what literature says. But where you really see these parallels with the changeling emerge are in these stories of the hybridization of, what we call aliens and human beings as well. There are descriptions in some of this abductee literature that look like they could have come from a book from, 1800s Scotland or something, describing a changeling. A lot of times these changelings in the British Isles were not only listless, but they had these scrawny arms and these large heads. In fact, some of the German terms for changelings actually were in direct relation to their heads, Kilcrops. They would have large eyes, and these are things that you see in the modern day abduction narrative as well as the listlessness. You see all this really reflected whenever abductees are presented with these hybridized children, these hybrid human alien children. They sound a lot like changelings. Similarly, there is this idea that these children could be, beguiled or lured into their captor's arms, and that's something that you see again in the abduction literature as well, generally through the presence of like screen memories. The late John Mack described things like, witches or, in some instances, things that looked like, your Disney-fied fairies, asking children to come with them aboard these, what they would describe later as crafts. So there does seem to be a lot of resonance there between these different things. And it's interesting.
Yeah. So are there any cases today that are truly just a missing child that are truly under fantastic circumstances that we're hard pressed to really understand? Now, I don't know how to ask this because there's a lot of missing children, and then people just say, well, they ran away, they did this, they did that, we never found them. But are there any that are just truly fantastic where we're just all like, this could be one of those?
Well, this was a real problem that was bandied about in the late 80s and early 90s in ufology, to the extent that they really sort of set up this arguably pseudo-scientific concept of false memory syndrome, this idea that children would deliberately, weave these fantastical stories. And, I say quasi-pseudo-scientific. I think that in the case of the Satanic Panic, children were being fed certain things to say by their parents and by authority figures to sort of implicate people. But, at the same time, I think that, as you alluded to earlier, I think that some of the best cases that we do have are some of these missing 411 encounters. Children who, oftentimes people don't come back. And that's always the big question, is like the people who don't come back, those are the ones that you'd really like to hear from. But there are plenty of children who do tend to come back in these missing 411 encounters. And a lot of the things you will find do tend to resonate with this earlier body of fairy folklore. I mean, so if anybody's unfamiliar with what we're talking about, the work of David Paulides, who has talked about these disappearances that are marked by all sorts of high strangeness in wilderness areas the world over, but specifically in North America and specifically in national parks are sort of where a lot of these happen. I've always said that the missing 411 stuff is like a paranormal Rorschach test. So whatever you're really interested to is what you're going to see. So if you're into Bigfoot, it's all about Bigfoot and alien abductions and government conspiracies or whatever, And so I say that fully realizing the irony of me saying, well, this is obviously fairy folklore, right? But it's, I do think that that the fairy, not explanation because that's being a bit too charitable, but the possibility of looking at the missing 411 parameters through fairy folklore, I think is really rewarding and doesn't get nearly enough attention. I mean, you see a lot of these clusters that he describes of children being picked up or disappearing in boulder fields or in streams. Well, these are, certainly places where fairy folk were believed to live. I mean, to this day in Iceland, roads are still rerouted around prominent boulders that are believed to be the home of the Huldafolk, the hidden folk. And, similarly, any body of water was believed to have at least some form of genus loci around it. I believe it was a former Sorbonne historian, Claude Lécouteau, said that we could primarily understand fairies as sort of aquatic spirits. So there's that factor. Paulides has noted that a lot of the people that go missing, including children, tend to wear bright clothing. Well, this was something that you could easily offend the fairies by doing, was by putting on the wrong article of clothing. Now, depending, again, region specific and tradition specific, that might be various different colors. Sometimes they were very jealous, obviously, of green, wearing green on St. Patrick's Day. But also, in other traditions, they were either jealous of or fearful of the color red. So you'll find that component as well. The propensity for a lot of the searches in missing 411 to be stymied by storms or abrupt changes in weather. I think that is something that is a real large gaping hole in people who want to view the missing 411 phenomena as alien abductions or as, Bigfoot abductions or something, at least in the traditional way what we understand those phenomena. Because, even if you think that extraterrestrials are visiting Earth, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that they're, changing weather patterns. But, in folklore the world over, storms were, a symbol of fairies. In some cases, that's the way that fairies would travel, is that they would travel on storms. To that extent, there's an interesting story. Alien abduction researcher, this is a brief tangent before I come back around to missing 411. Alien abduction researcher Carla Turner, who's one of my unsung heroes. I don't think she gets nearly enough attention in the abduction community. Followed at length the stories of abductee Ted Rice, who claimed to have been abducted numerous times since his childhood. And during one of the earliest encounters, he recalls being taken by these aliens and his spirit being moved from one body into another. So you have sort of a changeling motif happening there. And him being returned back home in the midst of a storm, which again is that idea of the fairy storm, which also ties into the missing 411 stuff as well, because in these missing 411 cases, you'll have these searches, not only they're stymied by a storm or they're thwarted by a storm, but the storm will abruptly move in and abruptly move out. And sometimes after the fact, that's when you'll find someone typically in a place that's already been searched, and you'll suddenly miraculously the child will be there again. So I think it's a worthwhile body of folklore that I think goes under-examined and underappreciated when looking at those modern contemporary missing people's cases.
Yeah, when we think about this, in my head at least, when I think about paranormal and I think about aliens and blah blah blah, I tend to put them in two different categories, although I understand that there's a lot of potential crossover because we don't really understand each other. I think of supernatural and cryptid as being kind of cryptid maybe in between. Is there, other than UFO evidence, is there any physical evidence in the world that's in question about fairy folk or anything like this? Like, do we have a tiny little foot or you get where I'm going with this. Like with Bigfoot, we got footprints, we got some scalp up in Nepal or something. There's a few things that people are questioning. When it comes to fairy folk, is there any physical stuff that people are questioning?
Well, so the short answer is yes. But I'm skeptical and accepting of these sort of little bits of evidence all at once, and I'll sort of elaborate on that in a moment. There are bits of fairy ephemera that have been collected over the years. There are certain castles that you'll find in Scotland that have framed alleged little bits of a fairy flag. You'll find churches in the British Isles that supposedly have a tiny chalice that was taken by someone who had visited fairyland and picked up that chalice from a fairy hoard. One of the most compelling things that I've seen, or that I've not seen personally, but I've read about, is a tiny like inch-long shoe that is braided, and it's made out of leather, and they analyzed it, and it was actually made out of mouse leather, which the idea of someone killing and skinning a mouse and tanning its leather with a little is humorous. But at the same time, the idea of accepting fairies on that sort of physical basis, I can't go that far. I tend to think a little bit more dualistically in terms of somebody along the lines of Patrick Harper or even Jacques Vallée or somebody like that. I have a real problem with the way that a lot of people research paranormal / Forteana. They're really obsessed with this dualism of physical versus non-physical, and I think that's really a fool's errand. People want to say, for example, my last book and the upcoming book is part 2 of it are both about Bigfoot. And after looking into it, I'm pretty convinced that there's a very strange non-physical aspect to Bigfoot. But people say, well, Bigfoot's got to be physical. It leaves behind hair and footprints, and it leaves behind it craps in the woods and all this. But if you believe in ghosts can leave behind handprints and footprints, and they can slam doors and they can write on walls. So this idea, I think that we really need to separate ourselves from this idea that things have to be physical or non-physical. And in terms of stuff like these fairy flags or these fairy shoes, or even in the case of, alleged UFO metamaterial or UFO crash debris, I tend to think of them much along the lines of something like apports in terms of, psi research, or the sort of apports that you'd get in legitimate seances or in legitimate poltergeist cases. The idea that somehow things can perhaps even manifest literally whole cloth out of nothing, I think is a little bit of a different sort of approach to look at it. Because there does seem to be this sort of aspect to a lot of these phenomena that implies, at least in my sense, that they really have the keys to the car when it comes to where we're going with reality. So I think that the fairy shoe is compelling, but I don't think it's necessarily evidence of, a literal race of little people. I think we're still dealing with some sort of spirit phenomena. For anybody who's sort of, again, having trouble wrapping your head around that, not only think of the ghost example, but also think of some of this research that's gone into some of the research from folks like Dean Radin or Daryl Bem or Pim von Lommel, people who are really looking to expanded consciousness studies and psi research. In the case of psi research, it's all but settled science, in my opinion, settled laboratory grade science, that your mind can have a physical impact upon the world around you. And that's literally the non-physical being made physical. So that's where I tend to land with stuff like that. But at the same time, in terms of incontrovertible proof of any of this stuff, no, it doesn't exist. But I think in some ways, I don't think that's the point. People on the UFO side of things are constantly pushing for some sort of disclosure, like the United States government is going to confirm the existence of extraterrestrials or UFOs, whatever they may be. And I don't think that that's the point behind this phenomenon. I think true disclosure of any type really sort of lies within yourself. You've got to convince yourself of the overwhelming body of evidence. And that's kind of the most important thing. That might be the reason that these things exist, in my opinion.
Right. Wouldn't it be awesome if the government came out and said, UFOs don't exist, but this is fairy disclosure.
Right. My good friend Greg Bishop has a saying that I've adopted, which is that UFO researchers aren't telling the government everything that they know.
Yeah.
I really think that there's a lot more. I think that the authorities have a lot more questions than they do answers, honestly, about a lot of this stuff.
Right.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on the end here. Man, I have really enjoyed this topic.
Yeah.
This is a topic that I was really interested in. And I've really, really enjoyed it. So for the audience, you've been listening to Joshua Cutchin. We've been talking about his book, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abduction. So you have a speaking engagement, Strange Realities 2020 conference, September 25th through the 26th. What's up with that conference?
Yes, it's put on by my good friends Sergio Stevens and Adam Sane from the Conspiranormal podcast, and you can find out more about that at the website Strange Realities, strangerealitiesconference.com. Yep. And you can find details there. It's a really swell lineup. I wish it was an in-person conference because those are always a little bit more fun, but
nice.
this is where we are right now.
Well, look at the and see what they're having to do, you know?
Yeah, right.
Hopefully you don't have as many awkward clap moments.
Yeah, I was about to say, hopefully it won't be quite as awkward. My latest book was just released in May with my co-author Timothy Renner from the Strange Familiars podcast. It's called Where the Footprints End: High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomena. It's volume 1 of 2. We didn't want to write 2 volumes, but we were looking at this and like, this is a lot of information. So volume 1 came out this past May, and I'm very thankful that it seems to be really interesting a lot of people, and volume 2 should be out later this year. My co-author just released the cover artwork for that, so we're really excited to get that off our plates. So
that is exciting. So I see that you can get your book on Amazon, but do you have a preferred location for people to get that, or do you prefer to send them there?
Well, before everything was shut down, I would always say, go to your local bookstore and ask for them to order it. Up until my last book, all my other books, A Trojan Feast, which is about the food taboo, The Brimstone Deceit, which is about supernatural smells, and Thieves in the Night, which is about supernatural child abduction, are all published by Anomalous Books. And if you can go to your local brick and mortar store and order it that way, please do. I really lament the death of so many independent booksellers. The latest 2 books, because they're self-published by Timothy Renner and I, are only available, unfortunately, from Amazon. But again, you can often go to your independent bookseller and sort of bring them into the loop, and they can order it for you as well.
And where's the best place for people to find out more about you?
JoshuaCutchin.com,
JoshuaCutchin. I say this in every interview. I've been saying it for years. I hope to blog more, but that's definitely. In terms of my books and information, in terms of my books and where to find me, and keep a running tab of all my interviews. I keep all that very much up to date. So if you're really feeling masochistic and want to listen to 3 straight weeks of me, that's your one-stop shop.
All right. Well, I have a feeling some people might be, because this was a really, really fun
topic. Very interesting. Yeah.
I really enjoyed it, y'all. Thank you so much.
And then hopefully maybe sometime you come back on, because your Bigfoot.
Love to talk about Bigfoot.
And then supernatural odors. I mean, that kind of piqued me right off the bat right there, because as a horror movie fan, there's always the thing of sweet smells are ghosts and putrid ones are demons and stuff like that. I mean, I'm getting this from horror movies. I don't know. We'll have to have you come back on and tell us all about it.
It's a whole complicated thing, that's for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, you've been listening to Joshua Cutchin right here on Radio Wasteland.